Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Captain Doug McGowan, the Commanding Officer of Naval Support Activity Mid-South. And I've been asked again to give a quick summary of what occurred on the 1st of May in the flooding that occurred here at NSA Mid-South. So on the 1st of May, 2010, the installation experienced flooding that was as a result of a 1,000-year flood event that occurred here in the Mid-South. That event was precipitated by some rainfall that was between 10 and 15 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. The flooding that occurred here caused us to evacuate the entire base, caused us to evacuate base housing and all of the residents. It stranded people in their homes, it stranded people in their offices. It caused me to activate the Emergency Operations Center. It caused me to establish a Family Assistance Center on board the installation. It caused me to have to put a call out to the local community to help me in the recovery and response. During a 1,000-year flood event, there was an incredible amount of water and it was moving across the installation at a pretty rapid clip. We were very fortunate in this event that we didn't have any lives lost and we didn't have any significant injuries whatsoever. We were very fortunate in this occurred on a Saturday morning, so instead of 8,000 people, we had only about 1,000 people on board during the flooding. In addition to the effect on the individuals and the effect on the buildings that we had here on the installation, all the critical information systems that the fleet relies on for the management of the sailors' careers and all of the recruiting actions that we do in the Navy were also affected. We lost 19,000 NMCI accounts, which were housed here on the base, and other critical information systems like BPERS Online were lost as well. For our families, 252 families were evacuated. 105 families lost their homes in their entirety and all of their belongings in the flood. We had 66 total buildings on the base that were affected, and the total amount of damage that was incurred on the base was $52 million to the buildings and to all of the things that were lost from the families. We had about another $20 million of lost electronic equipment to the Navy writ large as a result of the flood. It is a real credit to the folks who work on this installation and a credit to the folks in the local community in that we had that devastating flood. We had up to 5 and 6 feet of water across the base, yet within 24 hours we had all of our families housed in temporary housing, and within 5 days we had everybody on the installation back to work and the work of the Navy was being conducted again. So that's the very broad brush overview. I'd like to talk about some of the specific aspects of how we got to this point in the flood. In the days leading up to the flood, the National Weather Service had forecast some unprecedented severe weather, and that's not unusual for us here in the Mid-South, as you know. We typically have thunderstorms in the spring, and that's not unusual for us, and that's something that we're typically prepared for. However, they also indicated there might be some surface street flooding and some flash flooding. Again, that is not necessarily unusual for us here in the Mid-South. It was Thursday afternoon when we first got news of this impending weather, and I asked, as the commanding officer, my staff and all the critical staff, I said, if they could please stay for the weekend here instead of leaving town, just in the event that we had something that occurred on the base. My mindset at that time was that we were probably going to have either some straight line winds, we might have some damage from trees being blown down during a heavy thunderstorm, or worst case, we could have a tornado that blew through. I just wanted us to be prepared to be able to respond. And that turned out to be a fortuitous case because I did have my entire staff here that were eventually able to get on the base. They weren't able to get here right away. On Friday, it began to rain. Friday evening, it began to rain even harder. And early Saturday morning, the severe weather that they had forecast actually did come to fruition. And in fact, we had a stalled frontal boundary over the Mid-South here that caused all of that precipitation to come down in a very rapid fashion. As I said, it ended up being between 10 and 15 inches, depending on where you were in a 24-hour period, which is a significant amount of rain. There were tornadoes in the area while this was occurring. Starting at about Saturday morning, the tornado sirens were going off, and they went off for about a 24-hour period of time. There were tornadoes on the ground, there were tornadoes in the local area as the flooding was occurring, but there was no significant damage as a result of the tornadoes that occurred. But it was an additional threat that we had to deal with. Just so people are aware how the base is constructed, we have had flooding here before. And as a result of the flooding that we had, there's a Big Creek drainage canal that runs the southern border of the installation. As a result of some flooding that we had in the 1970s, the Army Corps of Engineers did construct a levee system on two sides of the base, about 1.25 miles long on the east side and about 2 miles long on the south side of the base. And that was aimed at protecting the base from flooding of Big Creek against the 100-year flood. In the 1980s, we had a flood event. We actually had a 100-year flood event. We actually did get some flooding on the installation, though it wasn't as severe as the flooding that occurred in 1970. That said, flooding is one of those things that we considered in our hazard-specific annex for our deliberate planning for emergency planning, but it was not the principal threat. Typically, the threats we plan to here in the Mid-South are earthquake, tornadoes, and other type of severe weather, also winter weather and freezing rain, which are the typical things that we see here. So that's kind of the lay of the land for the base. Flooding isn't something that we were particularly expecting, except for some surface street flooding. And so as the rain was coming down, I was still very much mindful of tornadoes being the principal threat. I was also mindful of straight line winds, and I was mindful of surface street flooding and some flash flooding. So as the morning progressed, I got a call from the command duty officer at about 3:30 or 4 in the morning that we were having some surface street flooding. And that was not unusual because that was happening all throughout the Mid-South, in the city and in the county as well. I asked for a report back, and at about 4 o'clock, 4:30, I got the report that there was some additional surface street flooding. The water was rising, and in fact, some cases it was 6 to 8 inches deep in places on the base on the roads, and that all of the drainage ditches were now filled on the base. And that's the point where I decided I better come in and put eyeballs on it just to see how things are going. As it turns out, the flooding on the base occurred in two basic phases. The first phase was the surface flooding that was caused by that 10 to 15 inches of rain that was falling in the area. And the second phase was actually the flooding that was the devastating part of the flood. Talk about the first phase of the flooding. That occurred between, as I said, about 4 o'clock in the morning and about 11 o'clock in the morning. The rain was simply falling too fast for our drainage ditches to carry it away. As I say, Big Creek services us here on the installation, and we do have some natural flow that goes into Big Creek, but the rain was simply falling too fast for it to be evacuated from the base. I came in to the Emergency Operations Center. We had not yet activated it yet, and started to get some of the essential personnel by name back onto the installation and asked them to come in. At least we asked them to come in. They couldn't quite get here, as it'll turn out. But that surface street flooding continued to become more and more severe. And at about 0900, it was at the point where we started to receive calls from some housing residents in the two housing areas that I have on the south part of the base here, which are Cape Heart and Enterprise, that they were getting some water intrusion in their homes. Not flooding, but up through the foundation, they were starting to get some water intrusion. And in fact, the water on the streets in that area was between 1.5 feet and 2 feet deep in some places. It wasn't yet up to the houses, but there were some impassable areas. Because of that, I ordered an evacuation, a voluntary evacuation of the Cape Heart and Enterprise housing areas. That brings with it some additional challenges, as we'll get to later on in the talk here. Phase 2 of the flooding started after a lull in the action. As I said, all morning long, we had thunderstorms, we had tornadoes, we had surface street flooding as a result of torrential downpours of rain. At about 10:30, the rain stopped. And at about 11 o'clock, the skies parted and the sun came out. And so the voluntary evacuation that I had ordered and it was actually underway with some vehicles and some trucks and anything we could get our hands on, came to a grinding halt because the residents in that area of housing decided that the flooding was over. And quite frankly, I was hopeful that it was over as well. What I didn't know was that Big Creek is drained by a 94 square mile area. And the rain that we received is the same amount of rain that was received over that entire 94 square mile area. And all of that rain flows somewhere naturally, and it flows to the Big Creek drainage basin, which we happen to be just adjacent to. So 10 to 15 inches of rain over a 94 square mile area was flowing to Big Creek, and actually, since there is no flood monitoring system outside of our base and there is no ability for us to understand what is going on, and our immediate focus was inside the base, the water was rising outside of the levees on the installation. And it's important to note that our housing in those two areas are the things that are closest to those levees. And so the sun came out, the water in the streets actually receded because the rain stopped, and it went down to actually no water whatsoever on the streets because it was all flowing out the base on the southwest side of the base. On the east side of the base, the water was rising behind the levees. And at 11:30, quite frankly, there's no other way to say it, but all hell broke loose. As along that 1.25 mile long levee, all of that water from 94 square miles began to flow into the base at a very rapid rate. And in the housing area, it was rising at a level of 1 foot about every 5 minutes. And it got to 5 to 6 feet in people's homes. And this is when we went from a bad situation to an in extremis situation. Just to give you some sense of what was going on at that time, the 911 calls came into our dispatch center, which is adjacent to our emergency operations center. There were families who were separated completely at that time. Dad was at the office, mom was at the gym, and the kids were home alone. There were moms in their houses with 3 or 4 kids, and we got calls in saying I can only keep 2 of the kids above water at any one time, and I'm trapped in my house. There were many people who said, I need help. We are underwater and not sure how long we can stay here. It went in extremis very quickly. The rescue operations are what I'd like to talk about just a bit here to give you a sense of what we were dealing with. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I had a command duty officer, a second-class petty officer. I came in to the office. I had 2 dispatchers who were on the 911 console. I was fortunate that I had 6 firefighters on duty, and shift change for my firefighters is at 0600. And so I had an additional 6 firefighters who happened to show up at 0600. And I had 3 security officers on the base. So 12 firefighters, 3 security officers, 2 dispatchers, a CDO, and myself. That was the force with which we had to combat the surface street flooding very early in the morning. And so it became quickly apparent to us that that wasn't going to be sufficient, even for phase 1 of the flooding with all this surface water. We didn't know what to expect, but we figured that things were getting bad when, if you'll remember, I said I called people in singly into the emergency operations center. And the calls I were getting back after about 15, 20 minutes were, we can't make it, because the surface street flooding was so bad in town that my EOC members couldn't make it into the EOC. So while they didn't get the phase 2 flooding that we got, the phase 1 surface street flooding prevented a significant number of people from being able to report to work. So now, those people that I mentioned, we were alone and unafraid in the emergency operations center. I was fortunate that there were some other people at work on base, even though it was a Saturday morning, and there were some people who just decided to show up to see, to make sure. Most of them showed up to their office spaces thinking that they, in case some water maybe leaked in under the door, they wanted to get their personal belongings off the floor. But that turned out to be fortuitous because I did have some people there. As I said, I ordered a partial evacuation during phase 1 flooding. I only had probably a quarter of the people decide to leave their homes during that evacuation. And so the net result was, while I have a relatively small housing area of only 252 families, in that particular area there's probably 500 or so people that live in those 2 housing areas. The net result of the lack of compliance with that voluntary evacuation, where I still had 350 people who were still in those homes when phase 2 flooding occurred. And so now they couldn't get out, and they had to be rescued. When phase 2 kicked off, as I said, we had gone from a calm but bad situation to an in extremis situation. We had already ordered some buses to go down into those areas to remove people voluntarily. We had limited resources. I had 2 basically school-type buses that we use for base shuttles. Those were being used. My personal 4x4 truck was in use. Our emergency operations center truck was in use to pull people out. I have an Army Reserve Center here. We got a couple of Army sergeants out of the barracks who happened to be here that weekend, and we broke into the Army motor pool and stole some 5-ton and 2.5-ton trucks which some of our Seabees knew how to drive, and we got a couple of Humvees. In essence, we took whatever we could to get down in there and pull people out just from that surface street flooding. Fortunately, my incident commander, my fire chief, determined that this may be well beyond our capabilities here, and I'm not sure what to expect next. So he started putting the call out to the Emergency Operations Center saying, I need more support. And this all occurred very early in the morning. And so we put the call out to the local community saying, we're not sure exactly what we need, but we think we might need some help up here to help us get to some of these people who are, in their homes. And we got, some pretty severe surface street flooding. So that call went out. My emergency operations manager, my emergency operations officer actually showed up shortly after phase 1 flooding occurred. She was able to make it there and started making the call out to the local community with some of those partners we had already established relationships with through previous exercises. I knew that call had gone out, and I knew we had asked for help. I started making reports up to the region commander about what was going on, and he asked if we needed any help. I thought we had it well in hand at that time, and we had largely in hand all of the help that could possibly be there in a reasonable period of time. At the end of the day, we ended up using support from Shelby County, which is a local county, Tipton County, DeSoto County as far down as Mississippi, Fayette County, which is to our east. We used the Army Corps of Engineers, we used the Coast Guard, we used the city of Millington, the city of Germantown, the city of Memphis. At the end of the day, we had 26 different agencies that showed up with various levels of support, whether it was a vehicle or a boat. We ended up with 35 boats on the installation. I have no boats or rafts on the installation to use. All of those agencies just showed up. A significant presence, and one of the benefits of living in the Mid-South, is that we had some individuals just from the local area who heard what was happening and showed up with duck boats. These are just private citizens who showed up to do the right thing. We had one guy who was a duck boat captain, if you will, that rescued 50 people on his duck boat from their homes at the end, by the time things were said and done. A couple of reasons why we were successful, obviously, is because we had practiced some emergency management in the past. We had practiced with our tenant commands. We had inculcated them the importance of being a part of the team and turning and facing when we became the supported commander, which is a very rare occurrence, but they knew what to do and when to show up, and they were there with the right attitude. And they had exercised with us before. The tenant commands had shown up and been very robust participants in all of the tabletop exercises and the real exercises we had conducted. While we hadn't done a flood exercise, we had done earthquake, and we had done tornado, and we had done active shooter, and we had done winter weather, and we embedded all of the tenant commands into those exercises, and they showed up and participated, and that really helped out when the chips were down during the flood. So let's see, a couple of other things to think about. Forecast for bad weather occurred, surface street flooding, voluntary evacuation, somewhat complied with. Skies open up, everything's great. Then the floodwaters come into the base and we're in extremis. Have the rescuers I have on hand. I have some people from out in town showing up to assist us. And the question of the day is, how do you command and control all of these resources? And that's what I'll talk about emergency operations for just a second. I have an emergency operations center on the base. I activated that after I showed up and saw how bad things were, and starts an automatic recall of the appropriate people, both my staff and the tenant commands staffs that we think are critical to response to any emergency. That's where my 911 dispatch center is, and that's where our planning cell is. We were in the EOC. I had an incident commander out on scene. I had my XO go out and kind of be eyeballs on and tell me what was happening, and then just come back because I needed him on the team because he did show up when he was able to make it through the water. I stayed in the EOC. My role is not to be out seeing what's going on the ground, but to rely on the information I'm getting back and make decisions and look for resources and that type of thing. So even though I wanted to be out there, and that's the overwhelming urge to get out and find out what's going on, you have to trust your incident commander. So I had an incident commander in the field, and he was running the operation out there. I was with the emergency operations center manager. She was running the emergency operations center, and I stood back detached and trying to evaluate what was going on. And I think that was the right call. The reason I mentioned the EOC is that we practice a lot with our EOCs and all of the systems that we have. Just to give you some sense of what occurred there, we were not immune from flooding in the EOC. The first effect that we saw was my boss, the commander of Navy Region Midwest, Admiral Guyani, called to ask if I needed anything. And I told him that after I reported what was occurring, I told him that we had it well in hand. I would let him know, but we would keep a drumbeat of about every hour. And so I called him back an hour later to report what was occurring. And he asked that I update the C4I suite. And I had some folks by then who could come in and update the C4I, which is our ability to communicate. It's supposed to make things much more efficient so you don't have to have these phone calls. We had someone come in, they logged onto C4I, they started their updates, and that's when C4I went out because the circuit it was on got flooded out. So we had done some emailing at that point too, and then we quickly discovered that email was out. And so fortunately we still had phone circuits, and I was on the phone call with Admiral Guyani when the phones went out because of the flooding. And so no phones, no email, no C4I, but at least we had electricity until the electricity went out. And so this is in our EOC. Across the base, the electricity went out because the flood waters were getting so high. They were just, not only had the electrical circuits gone out, but all of the generators, the backup generators on base, were flooded out. So my 911 dispatch, we had a local backup generator that was a little higher than all the rest, so I was able to keep dispatch going for a while longer. But eventually, the water invaded the building that my EOC is in, and my dispatchers were actually dispatching with the water rising underneath them, and then we eventually had to abandon our EOC and go to a secondary location. Our secondary location was also flooded, so we had to go to a tertiary location, which was not planned in any way, shape, or form. It just turned out to be a space that we could go to. I guess somewhat fortunately, since we had no systems, any space was good enough. I had all I had at that point, since I had no phones, no electricity, no C4I, we had handheld radios, which were still working. We had portable generators, which we started up to recharge the handheld radios should we need to do that. And we had cell phones. And we had some people that brought some chargers so we could use some cell phones as well. And then the other piece that we realized that some folks had brought from home their laptop computers. And with an air card, they were able to still access the World Wide Web. And because we had that, we had a Facebook page as well. So we had social media and we had Twitter. We had already had an established presence via a Facebook page for the installation. We had some command credibility on there because I had monitored that and started making some interactions with some of our constituents on Facebook. Just as a side note, I think it's important to know that on Saturday morning, we had, Friday afternoon, I guess I should say, we had 800 fans of our Facebook page. So it was just kind of starting. But by Sunday afternoon, we had 3,500 Facebook fans. People were yearning for information, and that was the only avenue by which they could get it because there was no easy way for me to broadcast information. As I said, we lost all of our critical systems that we rely upon to provide information. A couple other things for Emergency Operations Center management. Again, since we had to abandon several of those EOCs and establish a tertiary one, we then had to rebuild that, and we had to advise people where to come for these meetings. Important in that is that you had to start establishing some kind of a drumbeat for what we were going to do. How was I going to get information out? How did I want information? How was I going to process it? At the height of the flooding, clearly there was information overload, and that's why it was very important for me as the CEO to be detached from the actual problem and to stand back to try to absorb this. And that's what I did, and that's what the XO did when it was his turn in the breach. And so allowing our people to do what they were trained to do. It should be noted that at no time did anybody take over the management of the Emergency Operations Center from that second-class petty officer, command duty officer. She started it, she was in the mix, she was running it very well, and so we did not relieve her of those responsibilities. She ran the Emergency Operations Center. Even when my emergency management officer showed up, she did not take over because this young lady was doing a fabulous job and we had other things we had to concentrate on. That was a very strong pull for us to jump in there and start directing things, but we let her do her job, and she did it exceedingly well. This is just part and parcel of standard leadership 101, but The most effective tool that I found in the feedback from the troops that were doing this thing was that we identified, from my perspective, here's the commander's intent, here's the purpose of what we're doing, here's the method by which I want you to accomplish it in general, and here's the end state. This is what I want to have accomplished at the end of the next period of time. And part of that was essentially establishing the top priorities. Life and limb, care of our families and getting them into temporary housing, taking care of the mission to the extent that we could take care of the mission, and restoring the mission capability in that order. So life and limb, taking care of our families, and then getting back to the mission to whatever extent we could to mitigate the impact on that. And they say that that helped them very define what their priorities were when they were looking for, what do I do next? It became pretty critical. And obviously we didn't change priority number one until we had everybody accounted for and everybody taken care of. And then we moved to putting everybody into some kind of a temporary or longer term housing situation and taking care of their needs. And then we moved to, starting to take care of the mission type aspects. So that's the EOC. The other final lesson from that, which I'll talk about when I wrap up at the end, is it's terrific when you have an exercise and you get all of your team members there. You have the logistics section, the operations section, the emergency management officer. You have all of your tenant commands in there, and everybody has their roles and responsibilities. And you have the security officer and fire and safety and environmental, and the whole crew is in there. And then the event occurs, and as I say, people have difficulty getting to the installation. The people you rely upon to be there are not there. And so you have people who are not experts in security or fire or environmental. And they had to pick up those roles. And that sounds strange, but that's the value of interaction, and that's the value of just having a robust exercise and, training scenarios regularly, because you're going to pick up what's important to the other folks. And sometimes you may have to do that for a short period of time until somebody can step in that's an expert. You just at least have to know what the basics are that drives that particular mission. So everybody there had to be cross-trained and everything else. It's a pickup game when people get there. So I said I was going to talk about mass care, and it really is a pickup game for that as well. When you have clearly, we had practiced our EFAC before. We had the EFAC team together, but we had gone through some drills with those kind of folks to find out what kind of gear they would have and how they would set up, and we had designated a place where we would do this. And in alternate, we were fortunate enough to be able to use our primary EFAC center. And so people trickled in, the evacuees trickled in, and then they flooded in. No pun intended, after phase 2 of the flooding, and we actually evacuated all 700 or so people from housing. And so we didn't know what kind of care we were going to have to provide. We didn't know if we were going to have to house them overnight, for weeks, what we were going to have to do. But all we knew is that we needed to start caring for them. And the team did a fabulous job. They started coordinating with the local community. We had some supplies. We got cots set up for everybody. We had enough cots for everybody there in case they had to spend the night. We started getting food, MWR. This is probably Sunday morning by now, but MWR was able to get some of their folks in, and we started providing some food there because we knew that the people couldn't get back to their homes. And then the gigantic supply train started filling up the south side of the EFAC with everything imaginable: clothes, food, baby food, diapers, dog food, you name it. And I know Admiral Guyani talked a lot about his experience in San Diego about the pets, and it was no less true here because we did evacuate a number of pets and had to do pet care as well. So caring for pets was a challenge, but we had learned some of those and we had planned for that. The value of partnerships in caring for families. We had established some really great partnerships with the local community over a number of other things, and they came to our aid, especially the city of Millington. What we didn't know, and the city of Millington didn't know, but during the height of the flooding, we were essentially cut off from the rest of the county. After we had a lot of our rescuers show up, there was a height of the flooding where nobody could come in or go out. And so Millington was our only resource after some of those rescuers had showed up. It was only a several-hour period of time, but we didn't know it until after the fact. But we had some really good connections with the city of Millington, the Millington Crisis Center, the Red Cross there, and so they came to our aid, as did all of our local families, to care for the families in the EFAC. So some terrific work was done there. You can't discount the value of the partnership with your PPV partner. For some of the folks out there, we have a PPV arrangement with our housing, and they were invaluable to taking care of our families. Some of the things that I was not aware of is that they have the ability to put people up in temporary lodging, and so I guess the very next people that showed up during the height of the flooding were our PPV partners. Actually, the director for our PPV here is in Great Lakes, and she actually was able to get on a flight. I couldn't imagine anything was flying, but she endured a flight to the Mid-South and showed up, and it was great to see her here. And then my local PPV partner was here as well, and they set up a table to take care of families' needs. And families checked in. They were given temporary lodging in a hotel out in town or an extended stay lodging, and they met the needs of our families, and it was on autopilot from my perspective, because they have processes and procedures in place to take care of this thing. Now, the ladies who did this are absolute heroes in my book, because they're absolute professionals and they did a terrific job. But suffice to say, of all of the families that we evacuated, there were 10 who stayed in the EFAC overnight. And remember, 11:30 in the morning, the entire base is flooded, mandatory evacuation. By midnight that night, because the flooding was going on all day, and we didn't get some people to the EFAC until 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. By midnight, every single family had a place to stay in a hotel, in a bed, and a warm place to sleep, with the exception of 10 people. 10 people chose to stay in the EFAC. I think they thought it was kind of cool because they were staying on cots and staying in the gym and sleeping over. But there were 10 people who chose to stay there. It was their choice. We had the ability to put them out in town. So there was nobody in my EFAC after midnight except for those 10 people. We did use that as a resource every single day, though. That was the central point where people came back to every single day to get their services, and it grew into what you would expect. It grew into eventually the place that they came back and they got some food, and they came back and got supplies, and then we coordinated everything from insurance claims to car insurance claims to giving them some Navy Marine Corps Relief Society, to the people from the claims office for the from Norfolk came out to do the Personal Claims Act work for families who had some damage. We had the USAA car insurance and some other car insurance folks parked their vans outside the EFAC. So it was literally one-stop shopping for everybody to come and have their needs taken care of there. Now, and they were in need, believe me. Those 105 families especially who lost everything. And when I say everything, absolutely everything. They walked out with the shirts on their back and nothing else. Everything else was lost in their homes, their cars, all of their belongings. And so it was, they were definitely in need. We had emotional care there. We had medical care there. We also had the Postal Service, again, one of those partnerships out in town. All those people, nobody missed a beat with getting their mail, because the Postal Service in town came and said, "What do you need us to do?" I said, "Well, these people are worried about getting their bills or getting their checks." And so on Monday, the Postal Service delivered mail to the EFAC, sorted and by each individual, and everybody was able to pick up their mail. So they didn't even miss a beat with the mail except for Saturday afternoon when the flooding occurred. The other thing that occurred is because we had a school liaison officer, one of the very first ones, because we have a great relationship with the local community. Again, as I said, the kids who were displaced from here, school was open on Monday, and the Shelby County Schools and the local school district worked with our school liaison officer, and the buses changed their routes to go pick up kids at these hotels where they were located. I'm not sure where else that would occur, but it was something I didn't think of, but they made it happen. They also set up transportation for the parents back and forth from the hotels to the installation. So there's a lot of good things that happened taking care of the families. On the 4th of May, because we were not alone in the flood, the installation was flooded. We had all of our rescue operations, and then our rescuers had to go away because there's a levee that protects the city of Millington as well. And fortunately, this happened in series and not in parallel, but the city of Millington was flooded about 5 hours after the installation was. And so all of our rescuers had to leave. Fortunately, we had rescued everyone at that time, and then they went to the city of Millington to help them. So there was some significant devastation in the city of Millington. They had a lot of evacuees. They did not have the benefit of what we had, which was a captive workforce here who could come and care for all of our evacuees. They had to set up some Red Cross shelters in the city of Millington. The Red Cross shelters, quite frankly, could not absorb all of the people that they had that were evacuees. And so on the 4th of May, I got a request from the mayor of Millington to establish a Red Cross shelter and care for their families as well. You've probably learned about DSCA, Defense Support to Civil Authority, and I had to exercise that. That went through Fleet Forces Command. This is a pretty good example of how the high visibility that something like this gets. When you have a flood, it was the highest level of visibility and a very quick turnaround. I got the request from the mayor. He sent it to me. I think he typed it up and I got it in a paper copy. Somehow we had an email account that I think his assistant sent it to one of my people in an email account, a personal email account. We sent that off to people who actually had email, and 45 minutes later, I had approval from Admiral Harvey on Fleet Forces to set up the Red Cross shelter. So 45-minute turnaround for a request like that's pretty rapid. So just understand that that could occur. We did that for 2 weeks. We cared for people in a Red Cross shelter from the city of Millington. So that added to our complexity of our issue. I'm going along, so the next thing I'll talk about is just kind of communications. We briefly talked about that before. But when everything else goes away, when your phones go away, your email goes away, also your website's going to go away, or at least your ability to access it and put information out. So we were left with, as I said, cell phones and social media. And I can't emphasize it enough. I was not a social media guy. I was not a Facebook guy. But the bottom line is it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter what kind of guy I am. It matters what kind of people my constituents are. And so if that's where they get their information from, then I just got to get over it and get on there, because they're the ones that are the customers, not me. And so it was absolutely beneficial for us to have an established presence on there. The other piece that we didn't understand was that we ordered an evacuation, and we had some loudspeaker systems on the base. We had identified that as a shortcoming before, but we didn't realize how bad it was. We said, let's get on the loudspeaker, the giant voice, and let's announce that we have a base evacuation. Well, that turned out to be like Charlie Brown's teacher. You know, nobody could hear it. Oh, by the way, there's no coverage in housing. There's no speakers in housing. So all the empty buildings on base, because nobody was at work, heard the evacuation announcement, but nobody in housing heard it. So we had to get on loudspeakers on whatever emergency vehicles could get down there to tell people to evacuate. And so that's not very effective. So as a result of that, now, we invested some money and we have a loudspeaker system that can cover everybody. But the bottom line is, information flow to people has to be multi-path. Two other things before I get into kind of my comments and lessons learned. Not really lessons learned, but just a couple of other comments. One was I wanted to make sure, probably 24 hours after we got the people safe, I wanted to make sure there was no follow-on catastrophe. The water that came through the base was contaminated, lots of sewer water obviously coming up in there. Granted, it was a lot of water coming through the installation, so you really didn't have to worry about it too much, but there were snakes. There were all kinds of things. This water has come from 94 square miles, so who knows? So we took a pretty proactive stance with preventative medicine and making sure that folks had the appropriate amount of PPE. We took a pretty proactive stance with inoculations and those kinds of things, and that was a big concern. But so public health is a big concern, and you got to think about that in very short order. As soon as you get things stabilized, that's the next big thing. What I didn't want to have is no injuries and no deaths, and then a gigantic epidemic outbreak of something else. So that's what we started thinking next. Kind of my wrap up of this is that, granted, I am an installation commanding officer of a naval support activity. I don't have an airfield any longer, and I don't have any port operations, and I don't support any seagoing fleet assets, but I am kind of the heartland of serve the heartland of America through this installation here. And it's very easy to get lulled into the sense of, well, this is just an administrative location, and so, there's not much going to happen here. But much like a carrier CO, he is the supporting commander to everything else that goes on. He's there only to launch airplanes and to be an instrument of diplomacy. they practice regularly being the support ed commander through general quarters. Should some damage occur to the ship, should there be a fire, and everybody turns and faces that commanding officer of the carrier. So I kind of had that in my mindset that said that is the worst case but least likely scenario, is that I become the supported commander. And when would that occur? It's only in emergency management is when that would occur, whether it's a anti-terrorism force protection action or whether it's an emergency like a flood. And so I took that and said that is my operational mission. And so I really stress to my staff that this is our focus of main effort for our operational mission. Realize that 99% of the time we turn and face and support all of our tenants and facilitate their mission, but we better be pretty good at our operational mission. And so from day one, we put into place a very robust series of exercises, tabletop exercises, round table discussions, interaction, and an engagement with the local community, getting out there and engaging with them on things that they're doing. And those partnerships paid off in spades. The other piece of that interaction is that it wasn't just my staff. We are the very small percentage on the base, but everybody here on the installation had been involved in some type of exercise before and were at least familiar with the fact that there was something to be done in an emergency and that I can't do it myself. I have to rely on the people who are tenants here. We had put into place kind of an emergency response team where we had identified the critical capabilities that individuals, even in my tenant commands, might have. Some folks who had some very special skill sets that I could use. The biggest thing you can do to turn people off and not get help is when people show up, not be able to use their help or not be able to funnel them in the right direction. Or if there's a YN that shows up, a yeoman that shows up, and you say, I don't need any more admin support. Well, if you had done some background research, you would know that they have a heavy equipment operator's license and have a commercial driver's license, can operate those buses that we were using. Oh boy, that's a skill set I can know. Knowing that ahead of time really helped us figure out where we could plug people into critical roles and helped us move along the volunteer force. And putting one person in charge of those volunteers and farming them out was also very critical. So we talked about the exercise. All right, so just a couple of thoughts to consider from the commanding officer's perspective here. First of all, that I mentioned it before. If an emergency occurs, you need to be thinking about that all the time. First of all, it's the thing that's in front of my mind is what if and what happens when I become the supportive commander if something occurs. But know that when you activate the EOC, that's not a magic button that people just magically appear and things are going to start rolling. You're not going to get the people that you thought you were going to get. It's going to be a pickup game. Hopefully you're going to get the vast majority of folks, but it's going to be a pickup game. If people can't get there, the cross-training has to have occurred and the mission has to go on. So don't be surprised by that. Your entire staff has to have a broad understanding of the general nature of things that need to occur so that you don't get paralyzed. The second thing is to act decisively. I'm glad that I ordered the evacuation at 9 o'clock. I'm not glad that I said, in hindsight, obviously, I'm not glad that I said, oh, it's a voluntary evacuation from enlisted housing, which is where our Cape Heart Enterprise is. It should have been a mandatory evacuation in hindsight. Didn't know it at the time, but act decisively. I didn't talk about it earlier, but there was a time when later in the day, there was a threat of additional storms after kind of the initial flooding had occurred. And, well, do I evacuate these other housing area or not? You know what? We just act decisively, evacuate the housing. And the other piece was, gee, how far out in the community do I reach for resources? I'm glad we acted decisively early on and said, we're not sure, send it. I can always turn them around and send them home. So obviously I think everybody who's in command out there is not unfamiliar with that. Act decisively instead of deciding to wait. Can't overemphasize the power of meaningful partnerships and value-added partnerships, and I've talked about that several times, I know, with your tenant commands and making them understand how important it is that they play a role where you need them to play a role in any type of emergency operations or ATFP type exercise as you desire them to do that, and then also outside the command. There were people that showed up from those 25 different agencies and municipalities that showed up simply because they had worked with us before. I didn't even put a personal request out to them. They just knew we were in need, and they knew us, and so they showed up. Kind of an anecdote to that is that there were other people who we hadn't interacted with, that we had learned that we might have been able to use some of their information, but they presupposed that we were the federal government, and so we probably had everything that we needed at our hands. And that wasn't obviously the case. So because we hadn't interacted with them, they didn't know. But that's the power of partnerships. Let's see. We talked about there's no one way that gets the communications job done. You got to have multipath communications, you got to have redundancy, and you got to be willing to get out of your typical, the way in which you put information out, because there's no one way that's going to get it done, and there's going to be a lot of churn that goes on anytime there's an emergency. I think everybody expects that. All the way down to line of sight communication methodologies, yelling at people, knocking on doors, loudspeakers, that kind of thing. As I said, we reverted all the way back to cell phones, Facebook, and handheld radios to run this entire emergency, in essence. The last bullet point is that commander's intent, in my view, is everything. When this occurs, people are looking for direction. People will do a lot of things, and everybody's going to want to act. That may not be necessarily the way in which the most effective way to act. You need to give them some constraints on what they do, some restraints. You need to give them some framework in which to perform these activities. Moreover, some sense of structure when there is no structure anymore brings a sense of calm to the situation. When you looked out across this installation and the landscape looked completely different because everything was perfectly flat and shiny water, none of your landmarks were there. The radios were blowing up with people in extremis and 911 calls. It was frankly pandemonium at that point in people's minds. You needed to bring some sense of calm to the storm and say, okay, here are our priorities. This is what we need to be doing. And keep drumming those priorities in. And then carefully thought out priorities and carefully thought out commander's intent allowed people to continue to do their jobs. I asked everybody to please listen, to please understand the commander's intent, to ask any questions quickly, and then to go do their jobs. The flood occurred on Saturday morning, and we did 24-hour ops all the way through late Sunday evening. The Chief of Naval Operations showed up first thing Monday morning to view the damage himself. Sunday, we started some of the cleanup. I had given commander's intent late Saturday, early Sunday about what our priorities were, and had done the drumbeat 2 times in that 24-hour period with my staff. And then I was out of pocket for about 9 hours while the Chief of Naval Operations was here, and he toured around and he met with the families and all that. It's great to have that support from the top, but I was not available to answer questions about what needed to be done. Letting people do their jobs as they understand commander's intent is the most effective means. I just simply couldn't be there. Secretary of the Navy showed up that Thursday. And so, again, out of pocket for about 8 to 10 hours during the Secretary of the Navy's visit. You just can't be there all the time. And the people responded in a fabulous fashion. They just knew what needed to be done, and they did it. And it was just a little bit of guidance is all they wanted. We were exceedingly fortunate that this event resulted in no injuries and no deaths. I'm convinced, though, that was the case because we had a flexibly trained team. And when I say team, not just my staff, everybody on the installation feels like they're one part of the team. They knew in general what needed to be done because they had worked together. They knew in general who had what responsibilities, and that flexible team is what allowed us to have a lot of success. That's no less true of our community partners who knew kind of what our strengths and weaknesses were. They kind of knew who we were, and they were more apt to come and show up to help us out when we needed it. I think in summary, all I would say is that this is, for the very vast majority of people in the installation business, the operational mission you have. It's the lone time when people turn and face you and as the supported commander. And so you need to be prepared for that eventuality. And you need to be prepared through training. Kind of like they say, the will to win means nothing without the will to prepare. And so that's why we won this one, if you will, because we had the will to prepare. Yes, it is painful, and yes, it's an investment in time, but it is worth every single penny of that preparation.